All right, looks like a lot of folks have trickled in this far, so let's go ahead and get started. Nice to meet everyone. My name is Matt Garish. I am on the customer success team over here at Unit21, and today we'll be on our third session in our Power Up series, and this will be specific to workflows. So a quick agenda for what we'll be covering today. I'll go through just a general overview of workflows as well as a basic navigation of the Unit21 platform. We'll do most of this live and we'll build out some workflows together. And then I'll finish off with some key insights and takeaways that I've seen over the past 2 years of working with various customers at Unit21. And of course, we do want to make sure that this is interactive. So I'll leave a good, healthy chunk at the end of today's call for questions. Feel free to pop those in the chat throughout, and I'll make sure that I get to as many as possible. If I'm unable to get to those questions, I'm sure your main point of contact over here at Unit21 will be able to answer them for you. So like I said previously, we'll have Q&A at the very end, and this session will be recorded to everyone that has signed up. So what are we actually doing today? At Unit21 offers a high degree of customization for our customers. This is both on our rules engine as well as workflows, which will be today's main focus. So in today's session, we'll dive into some of those foundation. I'll also go through some tips and tricks, best practices. We'll talk about the different ways you can create workflows, both for, hey, maybe you might be getting started with Unit21 today. Maybe you've been a customer for a while, or maybe this is your first time seeing it. So we'll try to cover all of those bases. We'll also be addressing both from an individual contributor as well as a program manager side. And a lot of what I will be doing today is also spending time in workflow buttons, which are just a part of our workflows holistically. Those are very, very powerful, but we'll get to that momentarily. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So I am going to be in my sandbox instance today. So this may look a little bit different than what you have seen in the past. It is also filled with dummy data. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this process today. So for those that have been into Unit20 before, this is our home screen. This might look quite familiar. A few quick tips and tricks I do want to call out. First one, very, very simple. On top left-hand side, if you click on our logo, it'll pop open the left-hand navigation panel for folks like myself who don't want to actually memorize what every single icon means. And then from a setup perspective, at the top right-hand side, if you click on your name, profile, and then notifications, you can set up so that you receive email notifications opposed to in-app notifications. The reason I just wanted to call this out very quickly, if you're like me, you use 7 or 8 different technologies, and let's be honest, I don't want to have to go to each technology to get all the notifications. So feel free to configure this however you choose. This is all going to be based off of major actions, workflows today that are taken within Unit21. And for your program managers, now most folks will see the My Alerts page, but if you're interested in seeing a home screen load opposed to clicking to it when you enter Unit21, you can go ahead and set up your display settings here. Mine's on the My Alerts page, but we do have 4 options, really up to whatever you would like. So like I said, I'm going to go through briefly the navigation of Unit21, alerts, where to find the workflow buttons, what different things mean, so that we have some contextual relevance when we actually start building. Like I mentioned, let's go ahead and minimize that side screen. This is the My Alerts page. This is where most folks will get started when they enter Unit21. Couple quick things to note about the platform. This is going to be persistent throughout the demonstration today, but everything is very customizable, not even holistically, but on an agent by agent level. And this is indicative of this choose column section. So this choose column section allows each agents, and this can be overridden for your program managers on the phone today, overridden for something that's standard. But this can be customized for each and every agent because let's be honest, no 2 people work exactly the same. And while the data might be the same, individuals may digest it differently. This is going to be saved every time you logged out of Unit21. So if you are configuring your My Alert section or even your admin alert sections, next time you log into Unit21, it'll be the view that you would like. Right. A couple other things to note just in terms of setup and best practices. Very similarly is with these alerts. You can see this little pin here. This will make this persistent at top of the screen. So if you are doing the same search over and over again, just go ahead and load everything that you typically use. Very similar to the choose columns. It'll save next time you log in, you'll have the appropriate filters. There's also another option here, which is the group by. This is relatively new for folks that are using Unit 21 today. You may have seen this last week, but this allows us to give us the traditional view. So all our alerts listed out, as well as a group by entity. So really what this allows us to do is deduplicate the process of the investigation, because let's be honest, if the same entity is alerting 10 to 12 times, we definitely don't want 10 or 12 different agents working the same entity, which is typically our point of entry for an investigation. So this works in both the My Alerts section as well as the admin section. Now, the only difference here is the My Alerts section is going to be based off of the queues and permissions I have access to. So if you recall earlier when I opened up this left-hand navigation panel, this may look different for some folks in the room. Don't worry, it's not broken. It's just how it was configured by your program administrator. So in this example, it looks like I only have a team assigned to one alert queue, which is default alert queue. So it's only going to reflect things within that said alert queue. Now, another thing to note, and this is just in terms of, potentially gamification or, how do we make sure we're always working the highest priority alerts? Let's say there's an audit coming. Let's be honest, those do happen. And the team needs to work all alerts over $100,000. We need to clear those off the plate before the auditors come in the next week. By using this filter, and let's see, well, it doesn't look like I have any $100,000 alerts. So let's go ahead and just pretend that it is 100. This filter will not only reflect in the My Alerts section, however, this will also reflect in the Get More Alerts button. So the Get More Alert button essentially acts as, hey, I want to look into this queue. Based off of the consumption order, I'm going to pull an alert. And if I see if there's any other open alerts for the entity, I'm also going to pull that in. So again, the quick use case here, you got an audit coming up on Monday. It's Thursday. You need to work everything over a certain threshold. If your agents go ahead and use this filter and then use the Get More Alerts button, after they finish every alert, it'll start pulling in based off of the thresholds that you've determined. So let's quickly walk into alert content itself. The idea around the alert is we're trying to provide as much information as possible to make a decision. So it could be everything from the rules that it's triggered. Now, in this case, I created this alert manually for today's conversation. It could be tags. Tags we'll get into a little bit today as well. Tags are essentially just overarching metadata that you can put on really any object within Unit 21. The beauty of tags is you can create such things as feedback loops that ultimately feed back into your rules engine or other bits of segmentation that you may not have the engineering resources to send into Unit 21 at that point. It'll have such things as deadlines. We'll also touch upon this. Deadlines are programmatic. So you can see I can edit it here. That's because I have all the permissions. We can go ahead and gate that as well for all your agents. And you can essentially set deadlines at each step of the process. So whether it's an L1 review or L2 review, or whether it's fraud versus compliance, it's really up to you on what makes the most sense for your processes. Scrolling down, we can see that we have a flagged entity. If you're using our rules engine, 99% of the time, it's going to be one entity to one alert, unless you're using graph-based rules. If you're sending in alerts manually, it can be multiple entities. However, like I mentioned previously, we have this choose column section, and we can configure it however we want. So if we are going through pieces of information before we make that decision, this is where you would do that. And then scrolling all the way down, we have such things as our prior activity section. Was this entity part of a prior alert or a prior case, or were they even part of a SAR filing? I'm going to go ahead and click on this ellipses here. And again, similar theme. Let's go ahead and customize this to what makes the most sense for me. And it looks like that my computer's a little slow. But we'll just go down the list very quickly. So we have our prior activity, we have transaction activity, which is going to be a combination of flagged alerts as well as non-flagged alerts, depending on what's associated with that entity. Investigation checklists, also something we'll be touching upon a little bit later today. Investigation checklists are a very good way to ensure that the right actions are taken before moving forward in the process. As you can see here, I have a very simple investigation checklist, and this is going to directly relate to our workflow buttons. So let's say, for example, you have a new cohort of junior analysts. Now, these junior analysts are probably the individuals you don't want looking at your highest value alerts or ones that need extra scrutiny. They're probably going to be looking at a subset that you, as a manager, have actually chosen. So what I can do is I can create these checklists that the agent will then go through. And once this is filled out, you can see that I now have access to workflow buttons to the right-hand side. There's a few different ways to set up checklists, and we'll get into that a little bit further as well. So we also have concepts of network analysis. You can add in documents to really any object in Unit21. Narratives and notes. Narratives you can templatize. Notes are more freehand form. Again, another quick time saver. If you're going to write the same thing over and over again, really no reason to have to freehand every single time, where you can just go ahead and pre-populate that information and then the investigator fills out the latter half. So like I said, going down the list, we also have such concepts of the audit trail. So all major actions that are being taken on the alert itself. So you have an understanding of, when was this assigned? What rule did it come from? Was it disposition, etc. As well as any custom data, or if you are sending action activity is similar to transaction activity. It's just another event like a login or password change. This is going to be more so fraud related. So if you're looking to create some basic ATO workflows, so on and so forth, yes, we do have some dormancy rules out of the box, but we might want to also bolster that with some of the action data from the individuals on your platform. So great. So this is an alert. Again, we'll go ahead and start actually clicking workflow buttons after we briefly talk about cases as well. So alerts, like I mentioned, typically have a one-to-one relationship. So one alert, one entity. Cases are a little bit different. And for our nomenclature, cases are going to be collections of alerts, events, or entities. You can think of it as trying to capture information around a lot of fraud ring or a large money laundering ring. That's when cases will be a little bit more pertinent. And you can see here, the anatomy is very, very, very similar. So the only things to note that are slightly different is that we are going to show you all the associations with that case. So the multiple entities, or maybe it's the multiple transactions or multiple alerts. This is a little nifty piece of functionality. This is a huge time saver that was released by the product team probably about 2 to 3 months ago. You don't actually need to add the transactions when you create the case. You can add them afterwards in this transaction analysis tab. As you can see here, I have all the transactions associated with the entity. I merely just need to click add to the case. I'm good to go. Great. So now that we walked through some of the basic anatomy, let's go ahead and take a step back and talk about how to build and why we build. So we talked a lot about workflows. I did mention queues a few times. I mentioned workflow buttons. Now, to start building, everything is going to be housed within this workflow section here. Now, the one thing I do to note is there's a couple different best practices I do recommend to customers. Everything is customizable, so everything's going to look a little bit different than your cohort, but I always do recommend let's scratch something out first, maybe on a piece of paper or whatever it might be before we start building. This just helps us actually agree on the foundation opposed to starting to backtrack. Now, you can always backtrack in Unit21. You could delete things, move things around. But I would say, really thinking holistically about that foundation first is going to be a lot helpful or very helpful when you actually enter and start building workflows for the first time. So like I mentioned, we have this concept of queues. And I talked about alerts being in alert queues, but we also have case queues as well as filing queues. So, traditional SAR filing or CTRs, etc. Queues, for how I think about it, are just stops on the subway. The alert is the passenger. The queue is the stop, whether it's Brooklyn or Manhattan. And then the workflow button really is just going to be a series of actions in a single click. So if that conductor wants to go from Brooklyn to Manhattan at a speed of 70 miles per hour, then he or she would just click that button. And that's really the intent of the workflow buttons. So to get started, you can see I already have a few built out queues. Now, what I'll end up taking you through in a live example is a traditional level 1, level 2 to case to SAR type of workflow. For larger organizations, it may be a lot more. For small organizations, this may fit. I would say typically less is more here. There's no reason to have 9,000 queues. And the reason behind that is it does make it a little difficult for load balancing. So if you're thinking about, hey, I have 12, 15 different fraud typologies and 12 to 15 compliance typologies, there really is, it's not necessary to create a queue per typology. What we really want to think about is the resources that we have to work the output of the typologies that we have set up. So I have seen where I have seen in the past, you would have a ATO queue or structuring queue, etc. I would recommend thinking about it more like a funnel. So what agents should be working which alerts? Because there could be some instances where it's very simple and the output should only be worked by L1, where it's more complex and it should be worked by L2. And all that's very configurable and controlled within Unit21. As you see, I have my queue name here. I have a description. I know it's small, but always have your descriptions actually make sense. Otherwise, you'll be clicking into things trying to figure it out. I have my queue subtype. And this is where I can set rules to automatically filter to set queues. So going back to my previous example, maybe I only want my L2 reviewers to look at alerts over $1 million. Well, I can set up a rule and then ensure that all rules are skipping L1 and going directly to L2. Just a good way to get some checks and balances within the platform itself. And then the other question is, how do I actually make sure it goes to the right person? You always want to set up your team permissions, and you can then assign one team or multiple teams to these queues. If we're thinking from a setup perspective holistically, my recommendation is, especially for smaller organizations that might be on the call today, be a little forward thinking in terms of how you're setting up teams. Most permissions are related to teams within Unit21. So even if you only have, let's say, 5 analysts and 1 manager today, think about the other steps in that process so that you can set them up at the get-go and just funnel individuals as they come into your organization into the appropriate teams. Once you do that, that individual will retain all the permissions and all the setup based off of adding them to said team. So going down a little bit further, I can see that I have the investigation checklist. I am a big fan of investigation checklists, but it's not always necessary. Maybe for reassigning an alert to a different L1 team member, you probably don't need to go through the investigation checklist, while marking as a true positive is probably a little bit more necessary. Again, we can gate specific workflow buttons, which I'll get into momentarily based off of the configuration. The concept of alert count threshold. You can think of this as another layer of validation. And this is part of the reason that I prefer having more bucketed queues opposed to something that's a little bit more spread out. Essentially, what this allows us to do is color code the throughput to the queue itself. So if I said, let's say, a threshold of 100 alerts in L1, and I wake up on a Monday morning, I check the queues, and there's a little bright red here, and I receive that notification. Maybe something happened in the market and we received a bunch of alerts, and that's something we need to address sooner than later. So that could be a good use case for using those thresholds. And then lastly are going to be your deadlines. Like I mentioned previously, deadlines are done programmatically. So every time an article hits a specific queue, it will receive that particular deadline. Now, you can do deadlines both at the queue level as well as globally. I'm more of a fan of the queue level. I think it's a little bit cleaner, but again, that's really up to you. What I've seen in the past is let's say something like an SLA of 60 days, and then the L1 and L2 reviewers receiving 30 days apiece. The days do not carry over. So that is one thing to note. However, all in all, pretty simple if I want to maneuver around the particular deadline for set queue. So this setup is going to look pretty consistent throughout. We have our case queues, and we have our filing queues. Right. But like I mentioned, queues are merely just a stop on the subway chain or the subway. How do we actually get there? So probably the most powerful thing within this concept of workflow are the buttons associated with the investigation. Workflow buttons are essentially a subset or series of actions within a single click. So let's briefly talk about how to set one up and what are some of the best practices around it. So you can see here, I can add a label, an icon, a color, etc. I can show or designate where this workflow button actually is shown. General rule of thumb, you definitely want to do this. Otherwise, your investigation screen is going to look a little bit messy. I typically recommend doing some segmentation around this because obviously some fraud actions may be different than compliance actions. L2 actions may be different than L1 actions. But with proper setup, and that's definitely something the customer success team can help out with, it should all move quite smoothly. I can show who this button is available for. So again, we do have that concept of teams going back to the initial setup. And then we have something called external ID. Now, really all this is an ID associated with a webhook. What I mean by that is, obviously within the fraud space, when you go through an investigation, you may want to take permanent action on that user. So by doing this quick configuration, and there's also a webhooks tab that I can touch upon in subsequent calls for anyone that's interested, I can have it so that when I click on this button, it's going to send a response to my organization's backend, and that will be then configured to block said user. So a lot bigger with the fraud space, less so the compliance space, just something to keep in mind as you're going through and building out your workflows. So coming down a little bit further, we have our statuses. So in Unit21, you could think of it as we have 3 different statuses. We have status, disposition, and subdisposition. Status is here, disposition and subdisposition is at the bottom. Status is hard-coded. It is going to be open, closed, or in review, which is part of some of the QC functionality we recently released. Disposition is going to be the result of whatever you're doing, or maybe it's a marker for something that's continuously under investigation or something else of the sort. And then a subdisposition, which is more of your tertiary status, is this was marked true positive. Here's a few labels as to why. I would always recommend spending a good amount of time on specifically your dispositions and subdispositions. And the reason behind that is this is how we're going to report any type of ROI within Unit21 if we want to look at the necessary output of our investigations. So you can see here I have dispositions, and then I have something called a classification. So classification is internal to Unit21. And what this essentially allows us to do as a customer success team is ensure that we're monitoring the health of your program. And the reason it is we don't always understand the nomenclature around dispositions. I could write something as Matt Garish 123. As a customer success manager, I wouldn't know if that's good or if that's bad. So dispositions will help us when we're monitoring and tracking the health so that we can help course correct should we go off the rails. Additionally, this does help for a lot of the machine learning and artificial intelligence we've been developing for the last couple of years, including alert scores. So alert scores are AI and machine learning generated. And essentially what we're doing there is a numerical value of, is this record going to be likely to be nefarious or not? So just keep that in mind as you're going through the process for the setup. But let's go back to the workflow button itself. Again, we have our statuses, the investigation checklist, whether it's required, whether it's not. For buttons like true positive, we probably want to have a checklist associated with it, where if you're reassigning because someone's on PTO, a little bit less necessary. Bulk resolution, this is going to be bigger for your program managers out there. So for the admin screen, let's say you need to clear a bunch of alerts or whatever process that you have for that given day. What you would essentially do is you can grab bulk select these alerts, and then you can action them all at once. But that is, dependent on having that enabled. And then just going down the list a little bit further, we have the ability to create cases, create filings. You can create a filing either from alert or case. Case is more traditional. And the other thing to note here about the workflow buttons, you can move objects both horizontally and vertically. So I can create a case while moving alert to a different alert queue. Where that might be relevant is if you have, let's say, a 4i approach, and you have a manager that may be looking at everything in parallel with L1, L2. Obviously, you don't want to hold up anything within the investigative process. So you can have an L1 transfer to L2, and then once the L2 transfers to a case, you can also move that over to a different view for final sign-off. Whitelist. So whitelist is going to be for those organizations that alert quite a bit, but we know are not really that nefarious. So if Google is alerting every single time because they're breaking all your thresholds, we can create workflow buttons to whitelist either globally just for that rule as well as the appropriate duration. And then going back to what I mentioned about feedback loops previously, these workflow buttons in parallel with everything that happens up here, we can add certain tags that then reverberate down through all the associations. So if I have a situation where, let's call it, keep looking. It's not fraud, but it's pretty close. Someone I might want to keep an eye on. I can add this tag. Again, it'll go to the entity, events, and instruments. And then I can create rules on top of those tags that are inclusive or exclusive. So if this is someone that I know, hey, next time that they alert, we're going to probably have to take action on them. I can create a rule specific to that subset of entities with specific thresholds for those entities that can then get funneled into a separate queue. And if you are using that methodology, and let's say you want to actually remove the tag that was already associated, you can do that as well. Again, this is a good way to create feedback loops in Unit 21 without actually having to use any type of engineering resources. And then, like I said, we have our dispositions and sub-dispositions. I am a fan of disposition notes because not only can you report on that, but you can also report on actually the freehand as well. Again, really up to you on how you want to process it. All right. So let's talk a little bit further about some of the other aspects of workflows, and then we'll actually go through a workflow from one of the alerts that I've created previously. So we have our investigation checklists. So you can edit the investigation checklist name here. You can add it to specific alert queues. Checklists do have a one-to-one relationship with queues. But the cool thing about checklists is that they can carry over in a mutable state within the object's queues. So if you have an L1, L2, L3 process, L1 fills out the checklist, L2 can take a look at what has been filled out and leverage that as part of their investigation. So just a good way for information to carry over. Again, really up to you on how you want to actually develop that particular process. So when I create an investigation checklist, go ahead and add a description. We'll start by creating some groups, as well as what's required and what's not required. Again, required is going to be the fields that we do need to fill out for the workflow buttons. and then adding an item to this group. You can see we have a variety of different options here, as well as, again, another aspect on whether we should make this required or not. Narrative templates, again, very similar to checklists, but in the sense that there can be multiple narratives associated with any of the queues. But like I was showing previously, this is a way to cut out some of the freehand or some of the time that it takes for an individual to actually type out their notes. I would recommend having a couple narratives that are commonly used, especially if there's a common typology that typically gets flagged at your organization. Webhooks, that's going to be more of a technical configuration. Deadlines, again, we have global, but like I mentioned previously, I prefer more of your queue-based deadlines. And then dispositions, which is the page that you saw previously. Great. So workflow buttons themselves, I know I went through mostly alert workflow buttons, case workflow buttons look almost identical. There's not much difference just based off of where it is within the process. So I'm not going to walk through that too much further. However, there is another end goal of an investigation. That's typically some type of regulatory filing or something else of the sort. So quick note is if you navigate to report filings and then the gear bar here, Unit21 does offer discrete filing. So we do have a one-to-one connection with FinCEN, and we can pre-populate most of that information within the SAR filing itself. So if you are getting started with Unit21, just make sure you have all this filled out. When you create a new SAR form, not only information from the subjects or events or whatever else happened in the investigation will actually appear, but also the information that you've already pre-populated. This will save you hours and hours and a lot of headache if you are filing SARs or need to file SARs as part of your process. Great. So now that we talked a little bit through queues, workflow buttons, let's actually see one in action. So you can see here, again, I have my alerts tab. So I'm going to click into this alert. And previous in this conversation, I went through the investigation checklist. You can see that it is filled out here, which then gave me access to the appropriate workflow buttons. So I'm going to go ahead and hit my escalate to L2. And you can see now that the queue has changed based off of what I set up for that workflow button. There's only one of me in this sandbox environment, so I didn't remove any of the assignments just for the sake of this conversation. But you can see now that I have new workflow buttons that are not yet accessible. So as an investigator, I can go through my process. And as I mentioned, that L1 investigation checklist was carried over in a mutable state now to my L2 review. Let's go ahead and fill this out. And now I have access to said workflow buttons. So from here, if part of my investigation was that this needs to be escalated further, I can go ahead and create a case. Now, part of that workflow button that I did sign up for, set up for L2s, do require me to pick an assignee as well as to create disposition notes. From there, we're going to get two separate screens until the case is actually created, associated cases with this entity, as well as associated alerts. And you can see I can also pick an assignee as well. So maybe I want to, again, bring in these cases as part of the new case. And then from here, we're going to end up at a landing screen. This is very much intentional. So the case is not yet created, but the action on alert has occurred. And essentially what we're doing is ensuring that there's no rogue cases out there, because obviously from auditability standpoint, we don't want rogue objects out in the world. So if this all looks good, I can then create my case. Fantastic. You can see here, I do have access to all my workflow buttons, and that is because I did not add an investigation checklist for this particular queue. So going through this process, I can see, all right, well, I have one entity, a couple different events, but let's go ahead and actually, maybe through my investigation, I found a few different entities that were part of this larger fraud ring. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. Then go to the transaction analysis tab. And I can see, again, all of the transactions associated with those entities. I can also see all that have been flagged within rules. And maybe as part of this, I want to go ahead and add 4 of these to a case. Awesome. So I may need to add some documents. I may need to add some narratives as part of the investigation. But at the end of the day, I'm going to come over and I'm probably going to create a SAR filing. Now, there's a couple things to note here. This create filing button is a hard-coded button that you can essentially get rid of with permissions, if I recall correctly, but I always prefer workflow buttons. And I created 2 workflow buttons here, one to send to a high-risk typology queue and one to a low-risk typology queue. Now, while that may not always be super relevant, really what I'm trying to do here is just create some additional metadata and filtering when I actually go to the appropriate queue itself. So I'm going to go ahead and create a SAR filing, high risk, definitely needs to be a SAR. And here we go. So now I'm in the SAR filing. There's going to be some of that information already filled out based off of what I've already pre-populated. And then it's really just up to me to fill in the gaps. Now, again, the reason I created a high-risk typology queue and a low-risk typology queue is for filings. I'm going to go to admin. And we're going to go back to this choose columns, again, persistent throughout Unit21. There is going to be queue, which I can then leverage maybe with activity type for a QA process or something else of the sort, so that as a manager, I can see what was classified for my business as high risk and what was classified as low risk for my business. Awesome. So just to do a brief recap here, again, you can find all your workflows here. Workflow buttons are going to be, again, a series of actions that push an investigation through the process. Less is more. It's always less is more. I would typically recommend not having more than 5 to 7 workflow buttons per queue or for any investigation. And that's predominantly because if you give 20, 30 different options, there is always going to be potential for human error. And this is going to be very similar if you are setting up such things as dispositions and subdispositions. We want to make sure that we do have the appropriate buckets, but that we're not going overboard and creating 500-600 subdispositions, because that will take time for investigators to actually fill out. With that said, that does conclude my live presentation. So I probably went through some of this a second ago, but just to recap everything we talked about, again, build with the end goal in mind, scratch it on a piece of paper, think about it in your head, wherever it feels most comfortable, so that once you're putting pen to paper, figuratively, that you have the ability to create a foundation that you can then grow on top of. Like I mentioned previously in this conversation, we can always backtrack if we want, but it's a little bit more difficult than thinking about growth and thinking about expansion. All of these workflows and all these different options, they can align with whatever needs that you have, whether you have multiple different level 1, level 2, level 3 reviewers. Maybe you're going to be making actions at the alert level if you're in fraud. You never go to a case, you never go to a SAR. It doesn't really matter. As long as you have that thought in your head, we can probably build it. And yeah, that goes back to simplification is key, and that everything is customizable. For the customers on the phone, if you do have any questions around this specifically, always feel free to reach out to your customer success manager, and we can help you build and help you theorize and help you optimize these processes. All right, so let's move over to questions and answers. And it looks like we got several, so I'll go ahead and rattle through. So one was, how would I go about setting up workflows as a smaller team as opposed to a larger organization? Based off what I've seen and what I would recommend, I would say less steps here then. I don't think we need to go ahead and overwhelm with having multiple or 5 or 7 or 8 different queues from the alert level, 8 different queues at the case level. I think that overcomplicates things. What I would recommend is having more of a standard, maybe alert case to SAR without multiple steps at each one of those objects. And if that smaller team, though, is a mixture of compliance and fraud folks, it may make sense from a typology standpoint to have just different work streams. So all compliance, all fraud. But if that individual is more of a generalist, then I would go back to my original suggestion. Okay. Our team is not currently moving alerts to cases. What are the benefits of using cases versus sticking with alerts? Like I mentioned, cases are a collection of events, entities, and alerts. So if we think about trying to analyze all the information for a fraud ring, trying to do that over 10 or 12 different alerts is going to be rather difficult unless it's in a central and holistic place. That's really the intention of the case. And cases are also generally for individuals that are more familiar with those type of deep layered investigations, someone that can actually pick apart and go through to each one of those alerts or each one of those transactions to actually make the final decision. What are the best ways I can assign alerts to my team as a manager? Great question. So I'm a fan of using this Get More Alerts button. The reason being is when you assign alerts as a manager, let's say there's 4 people, you assign each one 100 alerts. Now, as the individual contributor, of course, they're going to try to get through all 100 alerts, but what's actually the quality of the investigation? Does someone have to go back and check their work? And are you really just further duplicating effort there? Now, you can definitely do that, and you can do that from the admin tab. I think I already have this open here. If I had a reassign button, and I may, I already have one ready, I can go ahead and just automatically reassign based off of the various filters. But I would lean more towards using the traditional My Alerts and Get More Alerts button. I think this will give you a better understanding of who's actually going through what, and again, what is the quality of the investigation. Do you recommend building your process outside the system first and then moving it into the system? I like my learning style is I like to scratch out some quick notes before I actually start building. I think really, again, at the end of the day, if you keep it all in your head, using the mindset of thinking of what the end goal should be before building just should be the only thing that you do. If it's a very simple process, you probably don't need to do it. And again, everything is editable. So if I don't like this specific button for whatever reason it might be, it is something I can go and change in a few clicks of a button. What are some of the features that you found save teams the most time when working through investigations? Anything that pre-populates. So if you're using SAR filings today, please do the SAR configuration. That will save you a lot of time. The other components there are going to be such things as narratives. If you're freehanding or free typing, whatever it might be, every single time, that's not a really good use of set time. And then, like I mentioned a little bit previously, the amount of workflow buttons and the amount of options. If you give too many options, it'll take too long to get to that option. I like things that are a little bit more straightforward. This is true positive. Here's the 6 reasons. I'm already adding disposition notes. There's no reason to give 300 to 400 sub-dispositions for them to scroll through. Okay, let's keep on going. Can you please expand on the built-in QC functionality that you mentioned? Yeah, so we've done a lot of work around QC and QA. We do separate those out. So there are a couple things to note as it relates to the QC process. And I believe I have it already set up in a different view. So one QC piece of functionality is this concept of classified or restricted queues. So there may be some neobanks in the room, and you potentially want to interact with your partner bank within Unit21, because the whole process of downloading and sending and configuring it the way that they would like is really just a very much a time suck. However, the issue there is you don't want your partner bank to see everything. So one part of this QC workflow is the ability to classify queues. Essentially what this does is for a queue that that team is assigned, and again, those users assigned to those teams, it's going to lock down any other records within Unit 21, such as they don't exist. For restricted queues, which was one of those options, it's a little bit different. The only difference here is that you may be able to see the record, but you can't actually access the information in the record. So that's one part of QC. The other part of QC is mark and review. And this essentially is the in-between between open and closed. So with this, you can actually change the investigation checklist while some of the other things are immutable. Now, the other side of the coin, which we recently released, is QA, which is going to be more of your traditional random sampling. Using these filters, I want to look at my program, or I want to look at a subset of agents. So that is also something that we do offer today. Yes, classified and restrictive queues are related to quality control. And there is a little more utility. I think it would probably make sense to give you a full demonstration of QC QA for the guests that answer those questions. So we'll have your appropriate customer success manager reach out and set that up for you. Examples of investigation checklists, use them a lot, but sometimes they seem like for the analyst to do something. Yeah, so checklists, I've seen a lot of different variations of checklists. I'll go ahead and get you some examples for the individual to ask that as well, because I do have a few follow-up questions as well for you, just based off of, what are you using today? What are you trying to do? So checklists I've seen to gate junior analysts. I've seen it from just a strict control process to minimize human error. So even though it's a simple checklist and it's not a junior analyst, we still don't want people accidentally clicking buttons, because at the end of the day, an auditor can pick a true positive at random, and that could be the true positive we may have made a mistake on. In other examples, I've seen checklists used for how they pipe information over to like a partner bank. So there's one piece of information the partner bank wants. So part of the process is having that checklist and that information specifically so that the partner bank doesn't have to go through everything. So that's one other way I've seen it before. You cannot add attachments to checklists today. You can add attachments to alerts. You can add them to cases. You can add them to entities. You add them to most places within Unit 21, but I do not believe we support adding to a checklist today. However, if that is something you're interested in, again, reach out to your customer success manager, and I would recommend putting in a product feature request. Okay. We have about 10 minutes left. Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay. Well, if there's nothing left, I appreciate everyone joining today. Like I said, my name is Matt Garish. I'm always here to help out any of our current customers or any of our current individuals interested in learning a little bit more about Unit 21. You will be sent a recording after today's call. And that's all I got. So I hope everyone has a great rest of their Wednesday, and look forward to hearing from some of you.